When exhausted waitress Michelle Kovac counted out her last $40 to help a well-dressed stranger who'd forgotten his wallet, she thought she was performing a simple act of kindness. But she had just saved the life of the monster who had been systematically destroying her 7-year-old twin's minds for months. The same predator who had shattered her own childhood 25 years earlier and had spent decades hunting her family across the country, waiting for the perfect moment to complete the psychological torture he'd started when she was just 8 years old. What Michelle didn't know was that this chance encounter was the final piece in an elaborate trap designed to steal her children forever, orchestrated by a man who had turned child abuse into an art form and had already left a trail of broken families and dead children across 7 states. But Principal Richard Hawthorne had made one fatal mistake. He had underestimated the fierce, protective love of a mother who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. My beautiful family and friends, welcome back. If you're ready to settle in for another unforgettable story, make sure you hit that subscribe button, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hearing from you, no matter where you are in the world, always makes me happy. And hey, if you enjoy this one, stay tuned, because there are always more powerful stories on the way, and you definitely don't want to miss them. Before we begin, do me a favor, like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone you love. You never know whose heart this story might touch. Now, let me take a moment to speak into your life. I pray that whatever burden you're carrying, you find peace that passes all understanding. I pray that in the quiet moments when no one sees your tears, God sees you and comforts you. I pray for healing over every broken piece of your heart, and strength to rise again no matter how many times life has knocked you down. May joy find its way back to you, even if you've forgotten what it feels like. May your faith be reignited, your spirit lifted, and may love, real deep unconditional love, surround you wherever you are right now. You're not forgotten. You're not invisible. And you're not alone. This community is your safe space, and this story, like all the others, is here to remind you just how powerful your journey truly is. Now, take a deep breath. Get comfortable, and let's dive into today's story. The fluorescent lights of Mel's diner buzzed overhead like angry wasps as Michelle R. Kovac wiped down table 6 for the 3rd time, her movements mechanical, practiced. The red vinyl booth had seen better decades, much like everything else in this corner of downtown Portland, including herself. At 34, Michelle's honey-colored hair was perpetually pulled back in a ponytail that had given up trying to look neat hours ago, and her green eyes held the particular exhaustion that came from working double shifts while your heart lived in constant worry. The dinner rush was winding down, leaving behind the usual suspects: a couple of truckers nursing coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, Mrs. Henderson from the flower shop picking at her usual turkey sandwich, and a man in an expensive charcoal suit who looked as out of place as a diamond in a coal mine. Michelle glanced at the clock, 8:47 p.m. Emma and Jake would be asleep by now, hopefully. 7-year-olds needed their rest, especially when they spent their days walking on eggshells, jumping at every unexpected sound, flinching when adults raised their voices even in laughter. The thought made her stomach clench with that familiar mixture of guilt and helpless rage that had become her constant companion these past months. The suited man at table 12 was patting his pockets with increasing panic, his face growing red as he searched through his jacket, then his pants, then back to his jacket again. Michelle had seen this dance before, the universal choreography of someone who had just realized their wallet was missing. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being heard. "Miss." Michelle approached with a coffee pot, noting how his steel-gray hair was perfectly styled, his manicured nails, the watch on his wrist that probably cost more than she made in 6 months. Everything about him screamed money and power, the kind of person who lived in a world where problems got solved with a phone call and a credit card. "Is everything all right, sir? I seem to have, well, this is embarrassing." His laugh was forced, tight around the edges. "I appears I've left my wallet at home. My wife's always telling me to double-check." He trailed off, running a hand through his hair, and for a moment, Michelle caught a glimpse of something almost vulnerable in his expression. The check sat on the table between them, $67.50 for a steak dinner, loaded baked potato, and 3 glasses of the house wine. Michelle's eyes automatically calculated. That was almost exactly what she had in tips tonight. Money that was supposed to cover Emma's medicine and put a dent in the grocery bill that had been growing like a tumor on her kitchen counter. "I can call my driver," the man continued, reaching for his phone. "He could bring." "Don't worry about it," Michelle heard herself saying, the words tumbling out before her brain could stop them. Her hand was already reaching for the folded bills in her apron pocket, the $20 bills and crumpled fives that represented 8 hours of forced smiles and aching feet. The man looked up at her, surprise flickering across his features. "Oh no. No, I couldn't possibly." "Really, it's fine." Michelle was already counting out the money, her fingers moving with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly how much she had at any given moment. Everyone forgets things sometimes. As she placed the bills on the table, covering his check completely, she thought about Emma's cough that had kept them all up last night, about Jake's shoes with a hole in the sole that he tried to hide by walking funny, about the phone call from the school counselor that she still hadn't returned because she was too afraid of what she might learn. "This is incredibly generous," the man said, and when he looked up at her, his eyes were a startling shade of blue that seemed almost familiar, though she was certain she'd never seen him before. "What's your name? I'd like to repay you properly." "Michelle," she said automatically. "And really, don't worry about it. Just pay it forward sometime." He studied her face with an intensity that made her suddenly self-conscious. "Michelle, do you have children?" The question hit her like a physical blow, so unexpected and so precisely aimed at her most tender spot that she actually took a step back. Yes. Twins. They're 7. Something shifted in his expression, a cloud passing over the sun. 7, he repeated softly. That's a wonderful age. So full of possibility. The way he said it made something cold crawl up Michelle's spine, though she couldn't have explained why. There was something in his tone, something that didn't quite match the words or the situation. "Yes, well," she managed, suddenly eager to end this conversation and get back to the familiar rhythm of work. "I should let you finish your evening." But as she turned to go, his voice stopped her. "Michelle, I hope your children know how lucky they are to have a mother who would give her last dollar to help a stranger." She looked back over her shoulder, and for just a moment, she could have sworn she saw something cruel flicker behind those familiar blue eyes. But when she blinked, it was gone, replaced by what looked like genuine gratitude. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You have no idea what this means to me." As Michelle walked back to the kitchen, her tips gone but her conscience clear, she didn't notice the man pulling out his phone and taking a discreet photo of her name tag. She didn't see the smile that curved his lips as he scrolled through his contacts, finding a number he'd called many times before. And she certainly didn't recognize the voice that had haunted her children's nightmares for months, the voice that had turned her babies from laughing, fearless 7-year-olds into quiet shadows who flinched at their own reflections. Outside, rain began to fall against the diner windows like tears, and Michelle shivered without knowing why. What do you think Michelle should have done in this situation? Would you have helped a stranger with your last dollars, even if it meant your own family going without? Share your thoughts below. I'd love to know what choice you would have made. The key turned in the lock of apartment 4B with the same reluctant grind it had made for the past 3 years, a sound that always reminded Michelle of her own exhaustion. The hallway smelled of old cigarettes and cleaning products that never quite managed to mask the underlying odors of too many people living too close together. She climbed the narrow stairs quietly, her waitress shoes silent against the worn carpet, a skill she'd perfected during these months of living with children who startled at every unexpected sound. Mrs. Chun from 4C peeked out as Michelle passed, her weathered face creased with concern. "They were so quiet tonight," the elderly woman whispered in her accented English. "Not like before. Before I could hear them laughing, playing. Now." She shook her head sadly. "Emma, she came to my door earlier. Asked if I had seen any bad men in the hallway." Michelle's heart clenched. "What did you tell her?" "I told her Mrs. Chun keeps watch." I told her no bad men get past me. The old woman's eyes were fierce despite her small stature. But Michelle, sweet girl, what happened to those babies? They used to run in hallways, chase each other. Now they walk like little ghosts. It's been a difficult time, Michelle managed, the familiar weight of helplessness settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. Thank you for watching out for them. Mrs. Chun reached out and squeezed Michelle's hand with surprising strength. You good mother. But sometimes good mothers need help too, yes? Michelle nodded, unable to trust her voice, and slipped into her apartment. The living room was bathed in the blue glow of the small television, volume turned so low it was barely audible. Emma and Jake were curled together on the second-hand couch, a fortress of pillows and blankets built around them. They weren't asleep. Michelle could tell by the way their bodies held tension even in stillness, always ready to run or hide. Mommy. Emma's voice was barely a whisper. At 7, she should have been all elbows and energy, gap-toothed grins and scraped knees from code playground adventures. Instead, she moved through the world like a person trying not to leave footprints. Hey, baby. Michelle knelt beside the couch, noting how both children's eyes immediately scanned the space behind her, checking to make sure she was alone. How was your evening with Mrs. Chun? Good, Jake answered for both of them, which had become his habit. Her son had appointed himself his sister's protector, a burden no 7-year-old should carry. His dark hair stuck up at odd angles, and his pajamas, hand-me-downs from a church donation box, were too big, making him look even smaller and more vulnerable. Emma nodded but said nothing, her thumb finding its way to her mouth, a habit she'd broken at age 4 but had returned to 3 months ago. 3 months ago, when their world had shattered. Michelle sank onto the couch, and both children immediately pressed close to her, their small bodies seeking the safety they could only find in her presence. The familiar ache in her chest intensified, pride and heartbreak warring inside her as she felt how much they needed her, how much they trusted her to keep them safe, even when she felt utterly powerless to do so. Tell me about your day, she said softly, running her fingers through Emma's silky hair. We did math, Jake offered. I helped Emma with her numbers. The teacher asked where you were again, Emma added, so quietly Michelle almost missed it. For the conference thing. The parent-teacher conference. Michelle had missed it again, choosing an extra shift over facing Mrs. Patterson's concerned questions about why her previously outgoing children had become withdrawn and fearful, why Emma had stopped participating in class, why Jake had gotten into a fight with a boy twice his size who had simply raised his voice too loudly during recess. I'll call Mrs. Patterson tomorrow, Michelle promised, knowing she probably wouldn't, knowing she couldn't bear to hear the confirmation of what she already knew, that her children were drowning, and she didn't know how to save them. Mommy, Emma's voice was even smaller now, he's not going to come here, is he? The question hit Michelle like a physical blow. He. They never said his name anymore, as if speaking it might summon him like some horrible fairy tale monster. But she knew exactly who Emma meant, the man who had torn their lives apart with the casual cruelty of someone swatting a fly. Principal Richard Hawthorne. The man who had held their futures in his hands and had crushed them without a second thought. 3 months ago, Emma and Jake had been typical first graders at Brookstone Elementary, bright, curious, full of the natural resilience that allows children to bounce back from skinned knees and hurt feelings. They'd loved school, loved learning, loved their teacher Miss Rodriguez who made math feel like magic and reading feel like adventures. Then the allegations came. A parent complained that Miss Rodriguez had been too affectionate with students, that she'd hugged children who were crying, that she'd let a homesick kindergartner sit on her lap during story time. In another world, these might have been seen as signs of a caring educator. But in Principal Hawthorne's domain, they became evidence of inappropriate conduct. Emma and Jake had been interviewed, along with a dozen other children. Not by trained counselors or child psychologists, but by Hawthorne himself, a man who approached 7-year-olds like a prosecutor cross-examining hostile witnesses. Michelle would never forget the day she'd received the call to come to school immediately. She'd found her twins in the principal's office, Emma's face streaked with tears, Jake standing protectively in front of his sister like a tiny sentinel. "Your children," Hawthorne had said in his cold, measured voice, "have been making inconsistent statements about their interactions with Miss Rodriguez. We need to get to the truth." The truth. As if truth was something that could be extracted from traumatized children through intimidation and relentless questioning. For 2 hours, he'd grilled them. 2 hours of a grown man looming over small children, demanding they tell the truth about hugs that had comforted them, about a teacher who had wiped their tears and celebrated their victories. 2 hours of turning love into something shameful and terrifying. When Emma had finally broken down completely, sobbing that she didn't want Miss Rodriguez to go away, Hawthorne had smiled, a cold, satisfied expression that Michelle would see in her nightmares for months to come. "There we have it," he'd said. "Clear evidence of emotional manipulation and inappropriate attachment." Miss Rodriguez was fired the next day. The children never got to say goodbye. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came later, when Michelle realized that Hawthorne hadn't just destroyed their beloved teacher. He'd systematically destroyed her children's sense of safety, their ability to trust, their fundamental understanding that adults were there to protect them, not hurt them. Emma stopped speaking in class. Jake started having nightmares about the bad man in the suit, who asked scary questions and made Miss Rodriguez disappear. They both began flinching when anyone raised their voice, even in laughter or excitement. And when Michelle had tried to transfer them to another school, she discovered that Hawthorne's influence reached further than she'd imagined. Somehow, mysteriously, their applications were always denied, their records somehow incomplete or under review. They were trapped in his web, and he seemed to take a sick pleasure in their suffering. "No, sweetheart," Michelle whispered now, holding Emma tighter. "He's not coming here. This is our safe place. Just us." But even as she said the words, she felt the weight of their falseness. Nowhere was truly safe when someone with power decided to make your life hell. And Richard Hawthorne, with his steel-gray hair, his expensive suits, and his cold blue eyes, seemed determined to squeeze every drop of happiness from her children's lives. She thought about the man in the diner, about his familiar blue eyes and the strange way he'd asked about her children. A shiver ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the apartment's inadequate heating. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and somewhere in the darkness, Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that their small sanctuary was about to be breached once again. Have you ever felt powerless to protect someone you love from a system that seemed rigged against them? What would you do if your children were being psychologically terrorized by someone in authority? Drop a comment. Your perspective might help others facing similar battles. The call came at 7:23 a.m., jarring Michelle from the first decent sleep she'd managed in weeks. Emma and Jake were still curled together in her bed, another new ritual born from their trauma, their need to be close to her through the dark hours when nightmares felt most real. "Mrs. Kovac?" The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, unfamiliar. "This is Sandra Martinez from Brookstone Elementary. I'm calling to inform you that your children have been placed on immediate suspension pending a disciplinary review." Michelle sat up so quickly her vision blurred. What? Suspended? For what? There was an incident yesterday. Both Emma and Jake became extremely disruptive during their session with Principal Hawthorne. Screaming, crying, refusing to answer questions about their previous statements regarding Miss Rodriguez. The principal felt their behavior was deliberately obstructive and potentially coached. The words hit Michelle like physical blows. Coached? They're 7 years old. And what session? I wasn't informed about any. The session was regarding new information that came to light about the Rodriguez case. Principal Hawthorne has reason to believe the children may have been influenced in their previous testimony. Michelle's hands began to shake. What new information? There was a pause, the sound of papers rustling. I'm not at liberty to discuss the details, Mrs. Kovac. You'll need to schedule a meeting with Principal Hawthorne to discuss reinstating your children's attendance. However, I should warn you, there may be additional consequences depending on the outcome of the investigation. Investigation into what? Into whether you coached your children to lie to protect Miss Rodriguez, and whether you've been deliberately undermining the school's authority. The line went dead. Michelle stared at the phone, her mind reeling. Emma stirred beside her, those two knowing eyes opening immediately, scanning Michelle's face for signs of danger the way a 7-year-old should never have to do. Mommy? Who was that? Nobody important, baby. Go back to sleep. But Emma was already sitting up, and Jake was stirring too, both of them reading the tension in their mother's body with the horrible accuracy they developed over the past months. It was about school, wasn't it? Jake's voice was flat, resigned in a way that broke Michelle's heart. He wants to ask us more questions. Michelle pulled both children close, her mind racing. An investigation. New information. How could there be new information about something that had never happened in the first place? The morning dissolved into a blur of frantic phone calls. Michelle called in sick to work. She couldn't afford to lose the shift, but she couldn't leave her children alone when they'd just been suspended from the one place they were supposed to be safe. She tried reaching the school board, only to be told that Principal Hawthorne had full autonomy over disciplinary matters. She called 3 different lawyers, none of whom would take her case, apparently, challenging a school principal required retainer fees she couldn't even dream of affording. By noon, Emma hadn't spoken a word, and Jake had thrown up twice from anxiety. The knock at the door came at 2:47 p.m. Michelle peered through the peephole and saw a uniformed police officer standing in the hallway, looking uncomfortable. Behind him stood a woman in a gray business suit carrying a briefcase and wearing the expression of someone who'd seen too much and been disappointed by all of it. Mrs. Kovac? I'm Officer Jenkins, and this is Ms. Patricia Wells from Child Protective Services. We need to speak with you. The world tilted sideways. Michelle opened the door with trembling hands, her mind immediately jumping to the worst possible scenarios. Had someone reported her for leaving the children alone while she worked? For the apartment's peeling paint or the cereal they'd eaten for dinner too many nights running? Is everything all right? She managed. Ms. Wells consulted her tablet with cold efficiency. We received a report of potential child welfare concerns regarding Emma and Jake Kovac. May we come in? Michelle stepped aside because she had no choice, watching helplessly as these strangers invaded the small sanctuary she tried so hard to maintain for her children. Emma and Jake appeared in the bedroom doorway like small ghosts, taking in the uniforms and official badges with the weary recognition of children who'd learned that adults in authority meant danger. Mrs. Kovac, Ms. Wells began, settling into Michelle's second-hand armchair as if she owned it. We've received concerning reports about your children's behavior and well-being. Reports from who? I'm not at liberty to say. However, we've been told that Emma and Jake have been displaying signs of severe emotional disturbance, including aggressive behavior at school, regression in developmental milestones, and concerning statements about their safety at home. Michelle felt the blood drain from her face. Concerning statements? What are you talking about? Officer Jenkins looked uncomfortable, but Ms. Wells continued with clinical detachment. According to our source, both children have expressed fears about getting in trouble if they don't say the right things. They've mentioned being scared to go home, worried about making you angry, and Jake specifically mentioned that Mommy gets sad when we tell the truth. That's... Michelle looked at her children, saw the confusion and fear in their eyes, and felt something crack inside her chest. That's not... They never said those things. Who told you they said those things? Our source is reliable and has significant experience working with children, Ms. Wells replied. Principal Richard Hawthorne has been extremely concerned about your family's situation. He's the one who recommended we conduct this welfare check. The name hit Michelle like a sledgehammer. Richard Hawthorne. The man from the diner. The expensive suit, the steel-gray hair, those cold blue eyes that had seemed so familiar. The way he'd asked about her children, the strange tone when he'd said, 7 years old, so full of possibility. Michelle's knees gave out, and she sank onto the couch as the full horror of the situation crashed over her. The man she'd helped, the stranger she'd given her last $40 to, was the same monster who'd been systematically destroying her children's lives for months. And now he was using her kindness, her one moment of generosity in a life filled with struggle, as a weapon against her. Mrs. Kovac. Officer Jenkins was looking at her with concern. "Are you all right?" Michelle couldn't speak. Her mind was reeling, connecting dots that painted a picture so sinister she could barely comprehend it. Hawthorne had orchestrated this entire thing. Somehow, he'd arranged to be at the diner that night. He'd forgotten his wallet, knowing she would help. He'd taken her photo, learned her name, and now he was using her act of kindness to paint her as an unstable mother who coached her children to lie. But why? Why would he go to such elaborate lengths to destroy her family? "Ma'am," Ms. Wells' voice was sharper now, "I need you to focus. We're going to need to interview the children separately, and we'll need to document the living conditions here." "No." The word tore from Michelle's throat like a battle cry. "No, you can't interview them. They've been through enough. They've been traumatized enough. Mrs. Kovac, if you refuse to cooperate with this investigation, I'll have no choice but to consider emergency removal of the children for their own protection." Emma made a small wounded sound, and Jake immediately moved to stand in front of his sister, his 7-year-old body rigid with protective fury. "You can't take us," he said, his voice shaking but determined. "We didn't do anything wrong. Mommy didn't do anything wrong. It's him. It's the scary man who made Miss Rodriguez go away. He's the one who's bad." Ms. Wells made a note on her tablet. "I see the children have been coached to blame school authorities for their emotional distress." "They haven't been coached." Michelle exploded, jumping to her feet. "They're telling the truth. Principal Hawthorne has been systematically abusing my children for months. He interrogated them for hours. He destroyed their sense of safety, and now he's manipulating the system too." "Mrs. Kovac," Officer Jenkins interrupted gently, "you need to calm down. Shouting isn't helping your case here." But Michelle was beyond calm. She was beyond rational thought. The full scope of Hawthorne's manipulation was becoming clear, and she realized with crystal clarity that this had all been planned. Every move, every encounter, every moment of false kindness, it had all been leading to this moment where he could tear her children away from her completely. He wasn't just content to terrorize them at school. He wanted to destroy their entire family. And he was using her own compassion as the weapon to do it. "Get out," she whispered, her voice deadly quiet. "Get out of my home." Ms. Wells stood, closing her tablet with a sharp snap. "Mrs. Kovac, I'm ordering a full investigation into this household. The children will remain with you for now, but they are not to return to school until this matter is resolved. Any attempt to leave the city with them will result in immediate intervention." As the officials gathered their things and headed for the door, Ms. Wells paused and looked back. "For what it's worth," she said, and for a moment her expression softened slightly, "Principal Hawthorne spoke very highly of your character. He mentioned that you're the kind of person who would give your last dollar to help a stranger. He seems to think very well of you." The door closed behind them with a finality that sounded like a judge's gavel. Michelle sank to her knees as Emma and Jake rushed to her, their small arms wrapping around her as tightly as they could manage. In the distance, she could hear Mrs. Chen's door opening, the elderly woman's voice sharp with indignation as she confronted the officials in the hallway. But Michelle could barely hear anything over the roaring in her ears, the sound of her world collapsing around her as she realized the full scope of what she was up against. Richard Hawthorne hadn't just stumbled into her diner by accident. He'd researched her, planned their encounter, and manipulated her into giving him exactly what he needed to destroy her. The question that haunted her as she held her trembling children wasn't how he'd done it. It was why. What do you think drives someone to such calculated cruelty? Have you ever encountered someone who seemed to take pleasure in others' suffering? Share your thoughts about what might motivate Principal Hawthorne's actions. Sometimes understanding the enemy is the first step to defeating them. The next 72 hours passed in a haze of desperate research and mounting dread. Michelle had called in sick to work again, a luxury she couldn't afford but a necessity she couldn't avoid. Emma and Jake hadn't left the apartment since the CPS visit, too afraid that stepping outside might somehow give Hawthorne more ammunition against their family. Michelle's laptop, a second-hand machine that took 5 minutes to boot up, became her lifeline to the truth. She searched every available database, every news archive, every social media platform she could access, looking for information about Principal Richard Hawthorne. What she found made her blood run cold. Brookstone Elementary wasn't Hawthorne's first position. Over the past 15 years, he'd worked at 7 different schools across 3 states. Each time he'd arrived with glowing recommendations and had left under circumstances that were carefully buried in administrative language, pursuing new opportunities, accepting a position better suited to his skills, mutual decision to part ways. But between the lines, Michelle began to see a pattern that made her sick. At Lincoln Elementary in Ohio, 3 teachers had been fired for inappropriate conduct with students during Hawthorne's 2-year tenure. At Riverside School in Indiana, an entire kindergarten class had been transferred mid-year due to behavioral concerns that mysteriously resolved once they were removed from his direct oversight. At Westfield Primary in Michigan, he'd implemented a child safety protocol that involved individual interviews with students as young as 5, conducted without parent notification or consent. Each time, he'd left behind a trail of traumatized children, devastated families, and teachers whose careers had been destroyed by accusations that never quite made it to court but never quite went away either. "He's a predator," Michelle whispered to herself as she sat at her kitchen table at 2 a.m., surrounded by printed articles and handwritten notes. But not the kind everyone expects. Richard Hawthorne didn't seem interested in physically harming children. His cruelty was more insidious, more calculated. He fed on their psychological suffering, their fear, their helplessness. He was a man who had found a way to torture innocents while being praised as a dedicated educator, a pillar of the community, a protector of children. And somehow, Emma and Jake had become his latest obsession. The knock at her door at 3:17 a.m. nearly stopped her heart. Michelle crept to the peephole, expecting to see police or CPS officials, but instead found Mrs. Chen standing in the hallway, her small frame wrapped in a faded floral robe, her eyes bright with urgency. "Mrs. Chen? What's wrong?" The elderly woman pushed past Michelle into the apartment, moving with surprising agility. "We need to talk. Quietly. The walls, they have ears sometimes." Michelle followed her to the kitchen, where Mrs. Chen sat heavily at the table and fixed Michelle with a stare that was suddenly much sharper than her usual grandmother-like demeanor suggested. "I know who that man was," Mrs. Chen said without preamble. "The one who came with the social worker. I know what he's doing to your babies." Michelle felt her heart skip. "How could you possibly?" "Because he did the same thing to my grandson. 5 years ago, in Seattle." The words hit Michelle like a physical blow. "Your grandson." Mrs. Chen's weathered hands trembled as she pulled out her phone, a newer model than Michelle would have expected, and scrolled through photos until she found what she was looking for. The image showed a bright-eyed boy of about 8, grinning at the camera with the unguarded joy of childhood. "David," Mrs. Chen said softly. "My daughter's boy. Beautiful child, so smart, so full of life. He loved school, loved learning, loved his teacher Mrs. Kim." Michelle's stomach clenched as she began to understand where this story was going. Hawthorne came to David's school as the new principal. Within 2 months, Mrs. Kim was fired. Within 4 months, David was having nightmares, wetting the bed, flinching every time an adult spoke to him. Within 6 months. Mrs. Chen's voice broke, and she had to take several deep breaths before continuing. "Within 6 months, my grandson was dead." The world seemed to stop spinning. Michelle stared at the photo of the smiling boy, trying to process what she just heard. Dead? How? Officially? Accidental drowning. David was found in the pond behind his school during lunch recess. Security cameras mysteriously malfunctioned that day. No witnesses. Just a tragic accident involving a child who had become increasingly unstable and unpredictable in recent months. Mrs. Chen's eyes were fierce now, burning with a grief that had hardened into something deadly. But I knew better. David was a strong swimmer. He was terrified of water after what Hawthorne did to him. He wouldn't go near that pond voluntarily. Someone led him there. Someone who knew exactly how to manipulate a traumatized 8-year-old boy. Michelle felt bile rising in her throat. Did you go to the police? Of course. But Richard Hawthorne was the grieving principal who had tried so hard to help a troubled child. He even spoke at David's funeral about the importance of mental health support for students. The investigating officers treated me like a hysterical grandmother looking for someone to blame for a terrible accident. Mrs. Chen leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. But I never stopped looking. I followed his career, tracked his movements, documented everything. Do you know how many children have died or disappeared in schools where Richard Hawthorne worked? 7. 7 children over 15 years. All ruled accidents or runaways, all children who had been singled out by him for his special attention. Michelle's hands were shaking now. Why are you telling me this? Because when I saw him in that hallway yesterday, when I heard him talking about your babies, I knew history was about to repeat itself. And this time, I'm not going to let it happen. From her robe pocket, Mrs. Chen pulled out a thick manila folder, yellowed with age and wear. Everything I've collected over 5 years. Police reports, medical records, testimonies from other parents who suspected but could never prove. Evidence that no single investigator ever saw because it happened across state lines, different jurisdictions, different timelines. Michelle opened the folder with trembling hands and found herself staring at a gallery of horrors. Photos of children, dozens of them, all with the same haunted look that Emma and Jake had developed. Medical records documenting unexplained injuries, psychological evaluations showing severe trauma, and at the center of it all, personnel files showing Richard Hawthorne's presence at each location where these children suffered. He's a monster, Michelle breathed. He's worse than a monster, Mrs. Chen corrected. He's a monster with perfect cover. Who suspects the school principal? Who questions the man whose job is to protect children? He's built the perfect hunting ground, and he's gotten better at it with each move. Michelle looked up from the files, her mind reeling. But why Emma and Jake? Why my children specifically? Mrs. Chen's expression softened with sympathy. Because they're perfect victims, dear one. Single mother, no family support, working multiple jobs, struggling financially. He always chooses families that can't fight back effectively. And your children, they have something that attracts him. What? Light. Hope. The kind of innocence that stays bright even in difficult circumstances. He doesn't just want to hurt children, he wants to extinguish that light completely. It feeds something broken inside him. Michelle thought about Emma's shy smile, Jake's protective instincts, the way they'd maintained their essential goodness even through months of trauma. The idea that someone would want to destroy that purity made her feel physically sick. What do I do? She whispered. How do I stop him? Mrs. Chen reached across the table and covered Michelle's hand with her own. We fight back. But we have to be smart about it. He's had 15 years to perfect his methods, but he's also gotten overconfident. This elaborate setup with the diner, using your kindness against you, it's more complicated than his usual approach. Complex plans have more opportunities to fail. From another pocket, Mrs. Chen produced a small recording device. I've been documenting everything since I moved here 6 months ago. I didn't come to this building by accident, Michelle. I've been following him, waiting for his next move. I have recordings of him talking to the CPS worker, phone calls he made from his car outside this building, conversations with school board members about your family. Michelle stared at the device. You've been recording him? Every interaction I could manage. Richard Hawthorne thinks he's untouchable, so he's gotten careless. He doesn't notice little old ladies with good hearing and modern technology. Hope flickered in Michelle's chest for the first time in days. Is it enough? Can we stop him? Mrs. Chen's smile was grim but determined. Not yet. But it's a start. We need more evidence, and we need to be very, very careful. If he realizes we're onto him. She didn't need to finish the sentence. Michelle understood the stakes completely. There's something else, Mrs. Chen continued. The diner where you work, it wasn't chance that brought him there that night. I have security footage from across the street showing him sitting in his car for 2 hours, waiting. He studied your schedule, learned your habits, planned that entire encounter. Michelle felt her last shred of doubt evaporate. This wasn't paranoia or coincidence. This was calculated psychological warfare waged against her family by a man who had turned child abuse into an art form. What's his endgame? Michelle asked. What does he ultimately want? Mrs. Chen's expression grew even darker. Based on the pattern from other locations, he'll continue to escalate the pressure until something breaks. Either you'll have a complete breakdown that gives him grounds to have the children removed permanently, or Emma and Jake will have an accident. Something tragic and seemingly random that removes them from the equation entirely. Michelle felt the world tilt around her. The idea that someone could be planning her children's deaths with the same casual calculation most people use to plan dinner was almost incomprehensible. But as she looked at the evidence spread across her kitchen table, as she thought about David Chen's smiling face and the 6 other children who had died in Richard Hawthorne's wake, she knew that Mrs. Chen was telling the truth. Her children weren't just being bullied or targeted for harassment. They were being hunted. And unless she found a way to stop Richard Hawthorne, Emma and Jake would become the 8th and 9th names on his list of victims. How far would you go to protect your children from someone the system refuses to believe is dangerous? What would you do if you discovered that a trusted authority figure was systematically targeting families like yours? Share your thoughts. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones hiding in plain sight. Michelle couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw David Chen's smiling face morphing into Emma's terrified expression, Jake's protective stance dissolving into the image of a small body floating in dark water. At 4 a.m., she gave up trying and returned to Mrs. Chen's evidence files, spreading them across her kitchen table like pieces of a horrific puzzle. That's when she saw it. Buried in the middle of a stack of personnel records was a newspaper clipping from the Riverside Gazette, dated 15 years ago. The headline read, "Elementary School Principal Receives Award for Excellence in Child Psychology." Below it was a photo of a younger Richard Hawthorne receiving a plaque from the mayor, but it wasn't his face that made Michelle's blood turn to ice. It was the school behind him. Riverside Elementary. The same Riverside Elementary that Michelle had attended as a child. Her hands shaking, Michelle pulled the clipping closer to the lamp. The article was brief, praising Hawthorne's innovative approach to identifying and addressing behavioral issues in young students and his dedication to helping troubled children overcome traumatic experiences. Michelle's vision blurred as memories she'd spent 25 years burying came flooding back. She was 8 years old again, sitting in the principal's office after her father had left, her mother working 3 jobs just to keep their apartment. She remembered the kind man with gray hair who had called her in for special sessions to help her cope with the divorce. Sessions that had started as normal counseling but had gradually become something darker, more invasive. Tell me about your dreams, Michelle. Tell me what scares you most. What would happen if your mommy went away too? Hours of questions designed not to heal but to find every crack in a child's psyche and widen them. Sessions that had left 8-year-old Michelle convinced that her sadness was dangerous, that her tears were proof she was broken, that trusting adults led only to pain. She remembered how he'd made her feel responsible for her father leaving, how he'd convinced her that she was too damaged for anyone to love completely. How he'd taken a resilient child dealing with normal family trauma and systematically convinced her that she was fundamentally flawed. The worst part was that he'd done it all while being praised as a caring educator who went above and beyond for his most vulnerable students. Michelle's hands were shaking so violently now that she could barely hold the clipping. Richard Hawthorne hadn't stumbled into her life 3 months ago when he became Emma and Jake's principal. He'd been destroying her for 25 years. The revelation hit her like a physical blow, so devastating that she actually gasped aloud. This wasn't about Emma and Jake at all. They were just the latest weapon in a campaign of psychological warfare that had started when she was their age. Every struggle in her life suddenly took on new meaning. Her inability to trust men completely, leading to relationships that never quite worked, including the one with Emma and Jake's father, who'd left when the twins were 2. Her constant feeling that she wasn't good enough, wasn't worthy of happiness or stability. Her tendency to give everything to others while believing she deserved nothing in return. All of it traced back to those sessions in Riverside Elementary, to the man who had taken a hurting child and convinced her that pain was her natural state. And now he was doing the same thing to her children. But why? Why would he spend decades orchestrating such an elaborate revenge? What had 8-year-old Michelle done to earn such focused hatred? Michelle forced herself to think back to those final sessions at Riverside, the ones right before her mother had suddenly announced they were moving across the country to live with Michelle's aunt. She remembered being confused by the abrupt change, devastated to leave the only home she'd ever known. But now, with adult perspective and the context of Mrs. Chen's revelations, Michelle began to understand what had really happened. Her mother had figured it out. Somehow, her overwhelmed, exhausted mother had realized that the helpful principal was damaging her daughter and had gotten them out before it was too late. The sudden move, the refusal to talk about why they'd left, her mother's paranoid insistence on unlisted phone numbers and minimal contact with anyone from their old life, it all made sense now. Her mother had saved her from Richard Hawthorne. But she hadn't told Michelle why, probably hoping to spare her young daughter from understanding the full scope of what had almost happened to her. She'd let Michelle believe the move was about job opportunities, about family support, about anything other than the truth. Michelle reached for her phone with trembling hands. Her mother had died 3 years ago, taking her secrets with her, but there might still be records, documentation, something that would prove what Hawthorne had done. But as she started to dial her aunt's number in California, a new horror occurred to her. If Hawthorne had been tracking her all these years, if he'd somehow orchestrated his position at Emma and Jake's school, then he must have been watching her family for longer than she'd realized. How long had he known where she was? How much of her life had been influenced by his invisible presence? The job at Mel's Diner, which had seemed like a stroke of luck when she desperately needed work, was that really coincidence? The apartment building with the unusually low rent, the one that had been available exactly when she'd needed to move closer to the children's school, had that been manipulation too? With growing horror, Michelle began to see the outline of a trap that had been decades in the making. Hawthorne hadn't just been destroying her children for 3 months. He'd been positioning himself to destroy them for years, carefully arranging the pieces of their lives to ensure maximum impact when he finally made his move. Michelle stumbled to her bedroom, where Emma and Jake were still sleeping in her bed, their small faces peaceful in the dawn light filtering through cheap curtains. Looking at them now, she could see echoes of her own childhood trauma in their expressions, the way they slept too lightly, ready to wake at any sound, their bodies curved defensively even in sleep. History was repeating itself, but this time Hawthorne intended to finish what he'd started. The sound of her phone ringing made her jump. The caller ID showed an unknown number, but something made her answer anyway. Michelle. The voice was cultured, familiar, and it made every nerve in her body scream with recognition. Richard Hawthorne. "I thought it was time we had a proper conversation," he continued, his tone conversational, almost pleasant. Adult to adult, without the pretense. Michelle's mouth was so dry she could barely speak. "How did you get this number?" "Oh, Michelle. I've had this number for years. I've had all your numbers. Did you really think you could disappear completely?" That your mother's little geographical escape would be enough to keep you safe forever. The casual cruelty in his voice, the way he spoke about her mother's desperate attempt to protect her, made Michelle's vision blur with rage. "What do you want?" she whispered. "What I've always wanted. To complete your education." Your mother interrupted our sessions before I could finish helping you understand the fundamental truth about yourself. What truth? His laugh was soft, appreciative. That you're exactly what I said you were 25 years ago. Damaged. Unworthy. Toxic to everyone you touch. Look at your life, Michelle. Look at your beautiful children and see how your damage is already destroying them. Michelle gripped the phone so tightly her knuckles went white. You're the one destroying them. You're the one. I'm simply revealing what was already there. The weakness, the instability, the inevitable breakdown. You were always going to fail them, Michelle. I'm just accelerating the timeline. You're insane. I'm thorough. Do you want to know what happens next? Michelle couldn't answer, but he continued anyway. Tomorrow, Emma and Jake will have another session with me. This time they'll tell me exactly what I need to hear, that they're afraid of you, that they don't feel safe at home, that they want to go somewhere their mommy can't hurt them anymore. And this time, there won't be any interruptions. I won't let you near them. You don't have a choice. The court order was signed an hour ago. Emergency custody evaluation, recommended by both CPS and the school district based on credible reports of parental instability and potential child endangerment. Michelle felt the world collapse around her. What court order? Check your email, dear. Or better yet, wait for the police officers who should be arriving. Oh, right about now. The sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway made Michelle's blood turn to ice. Through the peephole, she could see 3 uniformed officers and Ms. Wells from CPS, all of them carrying official-looking documents. You see, Michelle, this was always going to be how it ended. I tried to help you understand that 25 years ago, but your mother interfered. This time, no one will interrupt. This time, you'll finally learn the lesson I've been trying to teach you. What lesson? Michelle's voice was barely a whisper. That love doesn't protect anyone. That hope is a lie. That everything you touch turns to ash, and everyone you care about suffers for your selfishness in existing. The pounding on her door grew louder, more insistent. And once you've learned that lesson completely, once you've watched me take everything from you the way you took my perfect moment from me 25 years ago, then I'll move on to my next student. Your children will make excellent teachers for other families, don't you think? The line went dead just as Ms. Wells' voice rang out from the hallway. Mrs. Kovac. Open the door immediately or we'll have to take it down. Michelle looked at her sleeping children, at Mrs. Chen's evidence scattered across her kitchen table, at the phone in her hand that had just delivered her death sentence. For 25 years, she'd carried the damage Richard Hawthorne had inflicted on her 8-year-old heart. She'd let his poison convince her that she was unworthy of happiness, that she was destined to fail at everything that mattered. But as she looked at Emma's peaceful face, at Jake's protective arm curved around his sister even in sleep, Michelle felt something crack open inside her chest. Not breaking, but opening, like a flower blooming in concrete. She was not the broken child Hawthorne had tried to create. She was a mother. A warrior. A woman who would burn the world down before she let anyone hurt her babies. And Richard Hawthorne was about to learn exactly what happened when you underestimated the fierce love of someone who had nothing left to lose. Have you ever realized that someone from your past had been manipulating your entire life without you knowing it? What would you do if you discovered that your childhood trauma was orchestrated by someone who was still actively trying to destroy you? Drop a comment with your thoughts. Sometimes our greatest enemies are the ones who never stopped hunting us. I think he's going to try. And when it happens, you'll be the grieving mother who was too unstable to protect them, who drove them into the system where they tragically died. He'll console you at their funeral, offer his support, maybe even suggest counseling to help you cope with your guilt. The image was so vivid, so horrifically plausible, that Michelle actually swayed on her feet. Mrs. Chun reached out to steady her. "But we're not going to let that happen," the older woman said fiercely. "I've been preparing for this moment for 5 years. I know his patterns, his methods, his weaknesses." "What weaknesses?" "He's untouchable. He has the entire system backing him up." Mrs. Chun pulled out her phone and showed Michelle a photo. It was grainy, taken from a distance, but it clearly showed Richard Hawthorne entering an upscale hotel with a woman who definitely wasn't his wife. "Richard Hawthorne presents himself as a pillar of moral authority," Mrs. Chun said quietly. "But men like him always have secrets they can't afford to have exposed. This is just one of them." Michelle stared at the photo. "You think an affair will bring him down? After everything he's done?" "Not the affair itself, but the investigation that would follow if this photo found its way to the right people. His financial records, his travel patterns, his communication history. Once people start looking closely at Richard Hawthorne's private life, they'll find things that don't add up." Mrs. Chun scrolled through her phone, showing Michelle image after image. Bank records, travel receipts, phone logs, all meticulously documented over months of surveillance. "He's been very careless lately. Overconfident. He thinks he's untouchable, so he's gotten sloppy about covering his tracks." Michelle felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly extinguished by the crushing weight of reality. "Even if we expose him, it won't matter. Emma and Jake will still be in the system. The damage to their minds will already be done. Not if we move fast. And not if we're smart about it." Mrs. Chun leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Tonight, he's going to visit them in foster care. It's part of the support system he's arranged as their concerned principal. He'll go there to complete their programming, to make sure they're completely turned against you before the custody hearing." "How do you know?" "Because I've been monitoring his communications. The foster family thinks they're getting a visit from a caring educator who wants to check on the children's well-being. They have no idea they're letting a predator into their home." Michelle felt sick. "We have to warn them." "We will. But we're also going to use this opportunity to get the evidence we need to destroy him. He's going to make a mistake tonight. They always do when they think they've won. And when he does, we'll be ready." For the first time in hours, Michelle felt something other than despair. It wasn't hope exactly. She was too exhausted and terrified for hope, but it was determination. The fierce, protective rage that had been building inside her since the moment she'd realized who Richard Hawthorne really was. "What do you need me to do?" Mrs. Chun smiled, and for the first time, Michelle saw the steel beneath the grandmother's gentle exterior. "You're going to trust me, dear one. And you're going to be ready to fight for your children like you've never fought for anything in your life." As the sun set over Portland, casting long shadows across the city, Michelle felt the last vestiges of the broken child Hawthorne had tried to create 25 years ago finally crumble away. In its place rose something he hadn't counted on, hadn't prepared for, hadn't seen coming despite all his careful planning. A mother with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The final battle was about to begin. What would you sacrifice to save your children from someone who seemed to have the entire system on their side? When everything looks hopeless and everyone you trust has failed you, where do you find the strength to keep fighting? Share your thoughts. Sometimes our darkest hours reveal exactly who we're meant to become. At 8:15 p.m., Michelle crouched behind a parked car across the street from 1247 Maple Avenue, watching the modest two-story house where her children were staying with strangers. Mrs. Chun sat beside her, surprisingly agile for her age, a small device that looked like a hearing aid tucked into her ear. "Audio feed is clear," Mrs. Chun whispered, adjusting something on her phone. "I planted the listening devices this afternoon while the foster parents were at work. 25 years of watching spy movies finally paid off." Michelle would have smiled at the absurdity of the situation, a Chinese grandmother turned surveillance expert, if her heart wasn't hammering against her ribs with terror for what Emma and Jake were enduring inside that house. Through the living room window, She could see movement. A man in a dark suit, Richard Hawthorne, sitting on the couch with two small figures curled on either side of him. Even from this distance, Michelle could tell by their body language that her children were afraid. "He's here," she breathed. Mrs. Chen nodded, pressing a button on her phone. Recording started. Now we wait for him to reveal himself. The waiting was torture. Michelle watched through the window as Hawthorne gestured animatedly, clearly in the middle of one of his sessions with Emma and Jake. She could see her daughter's shoulders shaking, crying, but trying to hide it. Jake had positioned himself slightly in front of Emma, that same protective stance that had become his default since this nightmare began. Mrs. Chen's phone crackled with audio. "Your mommy doesn't really love you the way a good mommy should," Hawthorne's cultured voice came through clearly. "Good mommies don't make their children worry about money, or food, or having a safe place to live." Michelle's hands clenched into fists. "But she works really hard," came Jake's small, brave voice. "She works at the restaurant to take care of us." "Oh, Jake. Sweet, loyal Jake. Do you know why she really works so much? It's because she's trying to get away from you. Work is more important to her than being home with her children." "That's not true." Emma's voice was stronger than Michelle had heard it in months. "Isn't it? Think about it, sweetheart. How many dinners did you eat alone while mommy was at work? How many times did she choose making money over being with you?" Michelle felt tears streaming down her face. Every sacrifice she'd made, every extra shift she'd worked to keep a roof over their heads, was being twisted into evidence of neglect and abandonment. "She was taking care of us," Jake insisted, his voice wavering but defiant. "Taking care of you by leaving you alone? By making you worry about grown-up problems? By letting you see how sad and tired she was all the time?" There was a pause, and when Hawthorne spoke again, his voice had taken on the hypnotic, therapeutic tone that Michelle remembered from 25 years ago. "I know this is hard to hear, but sometimes parents aren't capable of loving their children the right way. Sometimes they're too damaged by their own problems to give children what they need. Your mommy loves you, but her love is broken." "No," Emma whispered, but Michelle could hear the doubt creeping into her daughter's voice. "Think about how much happier you've been today, here with the Hendersons. No worry, no fear, no walking on eggshells. You smiled today, didn't you? Both of you. When's the last time you smiled at home?" The question hung in the air like poison. Mrs. Chen looked at Michelle with fury blazing in her eyes. "He's doing it," she whispered. "The same thing he did to David. Making them believe their pain is their family's fault instead of his." Through the window, Michelle watched Hawthorne lean closer to her children, his voice dropping to that intimate conspiratorial tone she remembered so well. "I want to help you," he continued through the audio feed. "I want to make sure you're safe and happy. But I need you to help me too. When you talk to the nice lady tomorrow, Ms. Martinez, you need to tell her the truth about how scared you are to go home." "But we're not scared of mommy," Jake said, though his voice was smaller now, uncertain. "You should be, Jake. Think about what happened when the police came. How upset mommy got, how angry she was. Is that how a loving mother reacts when people are trying to help her children?" Michelle wanted to scream that she'd been angry because she was watching her children being stolen by the very system that was supposed to protect them. But she could hear Hawthorne's manipulation working, could practically see him planting seeds of doubt that would grow into full-blown fear. "I don't want mommy to be sad," Emma whispered. "Oh, sweetheart, mommy's sadness isn't your fault. But it's also not your job to fix it. Children shouldn't have to take care of their parents' feelings. That's what makes love unhealthy." Mrs. Chen suddenly gripped Michelle's arm. "Wait. Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" "He just made a mistake." Mrs. Chen was rewinding the audio, her eyes bright with triumph. "Listen." The recording played back. "Children shouldn't have to take care of their parents' feelings. That's what makes love unhealthy." Michelle frowned. "I don't understand." Those exact words, Mrs. Chun said excitedly. I have them in my files from the investigation into David's death. A witness reported that Hawthorne used that exact phrase during a meeting with David's parents. Word for word identical. Understanding dawned. He's using a script. Exactly. He's not the innovative, caring educator everyone thinks he is. He's a predator who's perfected a systematic method of psychological abuse. These aren't therapeutic insights, they're calculated manipulation tactics he's used on dozens of families. Through the window, they could see Hawthorne standing up, apparently preparing to leave. The session had lasted exactly 45 minutes, another detail that Mrs. Chun immediately noted. David's sessions were always exactly 45 minutes too, she murmured, taking photos of Hawthorne through the window. He's obsessive about his patterns. As Hawthorne moved toward the front door, Mrs. Chun quickly dialed a number on her phone. Detective Morrison? This is Mrs. Chun. I have the evidence you asked for. Yes, all of it. Audio recordings, photographs, documented proof of systematic child abuse. No, you need to act tonight. He's escalating, and those children are in immediate danger. Michelle stared at her. You know a detective? Detective Morrison lost his own nephew to Hawthorne 8 years ago in Phoenix. Another accidental drowning. He's been waiting for solid evidence ever since. Hope flared in Michelle's chest for the first time in days. Hawthorne emerged from the house, pausing on the front porch to shake hands with someone, presumably the foster father. Even from across the street, Michelle could see his satisfied smile, the relaxed confidence of someone who believed he'd successfully completed another phase of his long-term plan. He had no idea that everything he'd said in the past 45 minutes had been recorded. He had no idea that his carefully constructed facade was about to crumble. And he had no idea that the broken 8-year-old girl he'd thought he destroyed 25 years ago had grown into a woman who would move heaven and earth to protect her children from suffering the same fate. Mrs. Chen's phone buzzed with a text message. She read it quickly, then looked at Michelle with fierce satisfaction. Detective Morrison is 3 blocks away with a warrant. Richard Hawthorne's nightmare is about to begin. As they watched Hawthorne walk to his car, completely unaware that his world was about to collapse around him, Michelle felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Victory was finally within reach. Have you ever wanted justice for someone who seemed untouchable? What do you think it takes to bring down a person who's spent years perfecting their system of abuse? Share your thoughts. Sometimes the most satisfying victories are the ones that took the longest to achieve. Richard Hawthorne made it exactly 2 blocks before the police cars surrounded him. Michelle and Mrs. Chun watched from Mrs. Chen's apartment window as Detective Morrison, a tall, weathered man whose eyes held the same haunted determination as Mrs. Chen's, approached Hawthorne's vehicle with 3 other officers. Even from 4 stories up, they could see the exact moment when Hawthorne realized his carefully constructed world was collapsing. 15 years, Mrs. Chen murmured as Hawthorne was pulled from his car and handcuffed. 15 years of hunting children, and it ends on a Tuesday night in Portland. Michelle's phone rang. Ms. Martinez's number. Mrs. Kovac, there's been a significant development in your case. Can you come to the office immediately? What kind of development? The kind that changes everything. 2 hours later, Michelle sat in a conference room surrounded by people who had treated her like an unstable parent just that morning. Ms. Martinez, Detective Morrison, a police captain, and 2 FBI agents who had apparently been tracking Hawthorne for months without anyone knowing. We've been building a federal case against Richard Hawthorne for interstate child abuse and psychological terrorism, Agent Sarah Kim explained. But we needed concrete evidence of his methods, recorded proof of his systematic approach. Mrs. Chen's surveillance provided exactly what we needed. Detective Morrison leaned forward, his expression grim. Mrs. Kovac, I owe you an apology. And more than that, I owe you the truth about what your family has been through. He placed a thick file on the table. Richard Hawthorne has been using his position in schools to identify vulnerable families, usually single mothers, often with financial stress, and systematically destroying them. Not for money, not for sexual gratification, but for the pure pleasure of psychological domination. Michelle felt sick. How many families? 43 that we can prove. Potentially dozens more. In each case, he follows the same pattern: identify the target family, manipulate circumstances to maximize their vulnerability, then slowly convince the children that their parents are the source of their trauma instead of him. Agent Kim opened another folder. The diner encounter wasn't random, Mrs. Kovac. He'd been planning it for months. We found detailed surveillance reports in his home office, your work schedule, your children's routines, even recordings of phone conversations between you and your children's previous teachers. But why me? Why Emma and Jake specifically? Detective Morrison's expression darkened. Because you got away from him 25 years ago. Your mother's decision to relocate across the country was the only time in his career that a family escaped before he could complete his work. You've been his unfinished business ever since. The revelation hit Michelle like a physical blow. All those years of struggling with self-worth, of feeling like she was somehow fundamentally flawed, Hawthorne had been there in the background, a poison she'd never realized was still coursing through her system. He tracked your mother's death in the obituaries, Agent Kim continued. Started monitoring your life, waiting for the right moment to insert himself back into your world. When you moved to Portland and enrolled Emma and Jake in Brookstone Elementary, he arranged his own transfer to become their principal. Ms. Martinez looked genuinely shaken. Mrs. Kovac, I can't apologize enough. The children's statements this morning, we now understand they were the result of systematic psychological manipulation. We have audio recordings of him coaching them on exactly what to say. Where are Emma and Jake now? Michelle's voice was barely a whisper. Safe, Detective Morrison assured her, and asking for their mother. The reunion happened in a small family room at the police station, neutral ground where Emma and Jake could process everything that had happened. When Michelle walked in, both children were huddled together on a couch, their faces pale but alert. For a moment, no one moved. Michelle could see the confusion in their eyes, the conflict between the love they felt for her and the doubts that Hawthorne had planted. Mommy. Emma's voice was small, uncertain. I'm here, baby. I'm here, and I'm never going to let anyone hurt you again. Jake looked up at her with eyes that were far too old for his 7-year-old face. The policeman said the principal was lying to us. About you. About everything. Michelle knelt down to their level, not approaching too quickly, letting them come to her at their own pace. He was lying, sweetheart. He's been lying for a very long time, to a lot of families. But it's over now. He can't hurt anyone anymore. Emma slid off the couch first, approaching Michelle like a frightened animal testing whether it was safe. When Michelle opened her arms, Emma collapsed into them with a sob that seemed to come from the deepest part of her soul. I was so scared, Mommy. I was scared you didn't love us anymore. Oh, baby. I love you more than all the stars in the sky. More than anything in the whole world. Nothing will ever change that. Jake joined them a moment later, his small arms wrapping around both his mother and sister with fierce determination. I tried to protect Emma, he whispered against Michelle's shoulder. I tried to tell them the truth, but the words kept getting all mixed up. You did protect her, Michelle assured him. You both protected each other. You were so brave, so strong. I'm so proud of you both. Detective Morrison cleared his throat gently from the doorway. Mrs. Kovac, I wanted you to know, we found evidence of at least 7 children who died under suspicious circumstances in schools where Hawthorne worked. Your children's courage in resisting his manipulation may have saved other families from going through what you've endured. Emma looked up at Michelle with eyes that were starting to clear, the fog of Hawthorne's influence beginning to lift. Are we going home now, Mommy? Michelle looked at her children, her beautiful, resilient, brave children who had survived a monster's attempt to steal their souls, and felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Pure, uncomplicated hope. Yes, baby. We're going home. As they walked out of the police station together, Emma's hand in hers and Jake pressed close to her side, Michelle caught sight of the evening news on a television in the lobby. Richard Hawthorne's photograph filled the screen under the headline "Respected Principal Arrested in Multi-State Child Abuse Ring." For the first time in 25 years, the man who had tried to convince her she was worthless was being revealed to the world for exactly what he was. And Michelle Kovac, no longer the broken child he had tried to create, was walking into the night with her family intact, her children safe, and her future finally her own. 6 months later, Michelle stood at the kitchen window of their new apartment, watching Emma and Jake play in the small backyard garden they'd planted together. The morning sun caught Emma's hair as she chased a butterfly, her laughter carrying on the spring breeze, a sound Michelle had feared she might never hear again. "Mommy, look," Jake called out, holding up a small tomato they'd been nurturing for weeks. "It's finally ready." "That's beautiful, sweetheart. Bring it inside and we'll have it with lunch." The apartment was modest but bright, with windows that let in actual sunlight and neighbors who smiled instead of avoiding eye contact. Mrs. Chun had helped them find it. She decided to stay in Portland permanently, claiming that her investigative work wasn't finished yet. Michelle suspected the older woman simply wanted to be close to the family she'd helped save. The kitchen table was scattered with legal documents, not threatening ones this time, but papers that represented new beginnings. The compensation from the class action lawsuit against the school district would pay for Emma and Jake's college educations. The book deal for Michelle's story about surviving Hawthorne's abuse would ensure they never had to worry about basic necessities again. But more important than the money was what couldn't be measured in dollars: Emma's easy smile, Jake's return to typical 7-year-old mischief, the way both children slept peacefully through the night in their own beds instead of huddled together in fear. Mrs. Kovac. Dr. Sarah Martinez, not the social worker, but the child psychologist they'd been seeing weekly, emerged from the living room where she'd been having her session with the twins. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" Michelle braced herself. These conversations still made her nervous, even though Dr. Martinez had consistently praised the children's progress. "Emma and Jake are ready to graduate from therapy," the doctor said with a warm smile. "They've processed their trauma in remarkably healthy ways. Their resilience is extraordinary, but then they learned that from watching their mother." Michelle felt tears prick her eyes. "Are you sure? They've been through so much." "They have. But they've also learned that they're stronger than their worst experiences, that love is more powerful than fear, and that their mother will move heaven and earth to protect them. Those are the lessons that will carry them through life." Through the window, Michelle watched Jake carefully showing Emma how to check the other plants for ripeness, his protective instincts now channeled into teaching rather than defending. Emma listened with the focused attention of someone who felt safe enough to be curious about the world again. "There's something else," Dr. Martinez continued. "The FBI wants to know if you'd be willing to consult on other cases involving psychological abuse in schools. Your insights could help identify other families who might be suffering in silence." Michelle considered this. 6 months ago, she would have said no, would have been too afraid, too convinced of her own inadequacy to believe she could help anyone. But Hawthorne's greatest miscalculation had been underestimating what he'd created in trying to destroy her. "Yes," she said. "I'd like that." After Dr. Martinez left, Michelle stepped outside to join her children in their garden. The afternoon was warm and peaceful, filled with the sounds of a neighborhood where children could play without fear. "Mommy," Emma said, settling beside Michelle on the small bench they'd placed under the apple tree, "I had a dream about Miss Rodriguez last night." Michelle's heart clenched. Their beloved teacher from Brookstone Elementary had found a position at a school in California, but the damage to her reputation had followed her. Another casualty of Hawthorne's systematic cruelty. "Was it a sad dream, baby?" "No," Emma said thoughtfully. She was smiling. And she told me she was proud of how brave Jake and I were. She said sometimes good people have to go through scary things, but that doesn't mean the good people did anything wrong. Michelle pulled Emma close, marveling at her daughter's wisdom. Miss Rodriguez was right. And you know what? She's teaching children again, in a place where they appreciate how wonderful she is. Good, Jake said, plopping down on Michelle's other side with dirt on his hands and satisfaction in his voice. Bad people shouldn't win. As the sun set over their small garden, Michelle reflected on everything they'd survived and overcome. Richard Hawthorne was serving a life sentence in federal prison, his network of abuse finally exposed and destroyed. The 43 families he terrorized were slowly healing, connected now through support groups and shared understanding. But perhaps most importantly, Emma and Jake had learned the most crucial lesson of all, that they were worthy of love, protection, and happiness, not in spite of what they'd endured, but because of how courageously they'd endured it. I love you both more than anything in this world, Michelle said, wrapping her arms around her children as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. We love you too, Mommy, they said in unison, and for the first time in over a year, Michelle felt the complete, unshakable peace that comes from knowing your family is truly safe. The girl who had been broken at 8 years old was gone forever, replaced by a woman who had found her strength in the fierce love she bore for her children. And Emma and Jake would grow up knowing that love could conquer even the darkest evil, that courage could triumph over cruelty, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon against hatred is simply refusing to let it win. In the distance, Mrs. Chen's apartment light glowed warm and welcoming, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there were guardian angels disguised as ordinary people, watching over families that needed protection. And in a small garden in Portland, Oregon, 3 people who had survived hell together were finally truly home. What does home mean to you? Is it a place, or is it the people who love you unconditionally? Share your thoughts about what it takes to rebuild after everything falls apart. Sometimes our greatest victories come from the simplest moments of peace. Thank you so much for watching this story all the way to the end. If this touched your heart, then you're going to love the next one. It's just as powerful, and even more intriguing than you can imagine. So don't stop here. Click the video showing on your screen right now and continue the journey. I'll be waiting for you on the other side of that story. See you there.